Think about it. How much of what you do or I do comes because of envy? Why do I upgrade my iPhone? Why do I want to get a new car? Why do I go to school? Now, obviously, not everything in life comes out of envy. But I thought it was a fascinating, very troubling text to think about how much of my life, how much of your life might actually come simply purely because you're competing with somebody else that probably doesn't know you and doesn't even care. There's a Christian ministry called What's Best Next, and it was co-founded by a man named Matt Perman. I don't know the other co-founder, but Matt Perman, he does this thing called gospel-centered productivity. And Matt writes this in his book by the title of his ministry. Again, it's called What's Best Next. And he writes this in his book. We are to live all of our lives in a gospel-centered way. When we are driven by the gospel, we act in God's power and work for the peace and prosperity of everyone. So you have, on the one hand, you have Ecclesiastes 4. Solomon says, I've seen that everything everybody does to try to gain, to go to school and fill the bank account is because they're envying somebody else. And then Matt says the real essential to living well is this idea of living to bless other people. So today we're jumping into Essential Living Part 2. Last week, I proposed that the core reality of living well, of living essentially, is to live a life that is God-defined and a God-defined reality. We had Ecclesiastes say Solomon says, after I looked at all the stuff, I sorted through all the fluff and uselessness in life, and I came up with this fundamental need, and that is that, what was it? Ecclesiastes chapter 12, conclusion of the whole matter, fear God, keep His commandments. Micah said, God showed you, O man, what's good, to do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with God. So fundamentally, it's living a life where my reality is centered on living a life that follows God's purpose, that lives daily with a sense that God is active in me, through me, and around me. But what really does that mean? If we're to really expand that and dive deeper, how does essential living really, really look? And I want to explore that today in part 2. And I want to get some help from a woman named Irena Sendler. Irena was born in 1910 in Poland. And Irena played a pivotal role in the lives of Jewish children during the Warsaw Ghetto days. And I'll let you see just a little bit on Irena Sendler.
Wyście chce zakończyć. Not so long ago, it was Mother's Day here. So today, I would like us to celebrate that holiday in the name of some of the most anguished mothers in the world. The Jewish mothers who had to part with their children during those terrible times. And let us reflect on those Polish women who took the Jewish children in and brought them up as their own. Risking their lives every day and every hour in the process. They loved those children so much that when the war ended, they could hardly bear to part with them. So let us give thought to those mothers.
Irina's story is a powerful story. She's a woman of privilege in the Polish society. She was a social worker and had access to both the outside world and the inside world of the ghetto there in Warsaw. She had access to finances. She also had a key advantage. She was not Jewish. What struck me as I reflected, and there's a great movie called The Courageous Heart of Irina Sendler that really captures her story. And as I watched her story, what struck me is how Irina takes her advantages and leverages them to care for the disadvantaged in her Polish society, her Jewish countrymen. And here's what struck me. Irina is not a Jew. So she doesn't have to, in a sense of sort of saving her own flesh, she doesn't have to help the Jewish people. She's not scheduled or sentenced to go to some concentration camp or work camp. She is perfectly free to live out an unencumbered existence with her Polish countrymen, leaving the Jews to suffer whatever fate they might suffer. But what Irina does is exemplary and symbolic of the heart of God's purpose for all of us. Instead of looking at her advantages and the comfort it might bring her, she looks at her advantages and the comfort and respite and relief it might bring those with less advantage. See, for her, a God-defined reality was taking her resources, her advantages, and leveraging them for the betterment and blessing of those who did not have those resources. The result was that in October 1943, the Gestapo tracked her down, interrogated her, tortured her, and sentenced her to be executed. It was only through the intervention of the behind-the-scenes organization that was working against, it's called Zagota. They were working against the Nazi occupation. They were able to get some of the guards at the very last minute to let her free. Irina could have run at that point and escaped for her life, but what does she do? But around December, January, February of 1943-44, she is back actively engaged in helping the Jewish people and helping children. She takes her advantage, and at risk of losing her advantage, she employs herself in the betterment and blessing of others. This is at the heart of essential living. Irina, in her own words, says this: "Every child saved with my help is the justification of my existence on this earth, and not a title to glory." That's profound. My saving work doesn't make me a hero or someone special. My work of saving children is just the act of being fully, truly human in a God-defined reality. I'm just being a human, the kind of human God wants every human to be. I haven't done anything to get on the pedestal. It's normal, she would say at another time. This is what it means to live in a God-defined reality, where I leverage and spend myself to benefit others. I had read a book, and for my D-Min, one of the books at least that I read, had a section in which the author was reflecting. He said, what would life be like if you lived without being burdened down, thinking about yourself, what someone else thought of you, how you're going to get the next promotion, how you're going to work out getting this and that and the other thing? What if you actually lived unencumbered by that stuff and just lived to do good and bless others? And out of that, and then this movie about Irina, I came up with this little saying, and it goes like this. It's supposed to go like that. Switch the flow. And I want that to kind of maybe become a phrase in your life. And here's what I mean by switch the flow. In life, we can be this intake, right? Like in my marriage, I can come home and I can go take off my shoes and sit on the couch and be like, man, where is my wife? I'm really hungry right now, and I would like a tasty taco. So I can sit there and I can wait for my wife to do her job and get that tasty taco going. And I'm sorry, I'm not doing anything to define gender roles here. I'm just using an example. Or I can be at the church and I can think, man, the board needs to get themselves together because we got to get this done. Or I can be standing at the back door and be saying, man, it's so good. Thank you. You know, everybody says thank you. You're so nice. We're so glad you're here. And I'm like, so where is all that attention? Where is all that stuff going? It's going to me, right? I become a dead end, right? So this little saying, this little catchphrase, I actually use it quite often. I have a written out prayer, and it's this prayer that reflects a lot of the essentials of what I want God to do in my life. And one of these things in there is this phrase, switch the flow. Because I want to be reminded on a regular basis that I live my life not to be the end point, but to be an outflow. In fact, sometimes when I get up to preach, or I'm thinking about how am I going to do my teaching thing on Sabbath morning, how am I going to say, what am I going to say? And that little phrase helps to relieve my anxiety. Because it shifts my focus from what is so-and-so going to think? How are my stats going to be? Am I going to get likes or no likes? Or when I go to visit, on some other kind of engagement that makes me nervous, that I'm not sure how it's going to work out. When I think in my mind and I say, you know what, it's not about me. It's about flowing into the lives of others. That sets me free from worrying about how this comes back on me and allows me to focus my energy on how I can leverage who I am, what God's given me, how God's blessed me into blessing someone else. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how that works out because I'm not focused on the stats and the outcomes for me. I'm focused on the outcomes for the other person. And I think fundamentally, this is the biblical paradigm. In fact, as I look at the biblical paradigm on living life, I was struck with how difficult it was to actually find and narrow down the number of texts I was going to use this morning to talk about this idea of essential living, outflow. It permeates the scriptures. And here's the beginning of that. Hebrews chapter 2 gives us this example of Jesus. For it was fitting for him, for whom are all things and by whom are all things. So listen, Irina Sendler had some advantages. She was not Jewish. She was a social worker. She had government connections. She had financial connections. And she had access connections inside and outside of the ghetto. Then we come to this text about Jesus. And he is, for whom everything's for him, by him. Like he has all the resources. Does he need to come to earth and do something for us? No. But the way God lives and exists is he takes his resources and he leverages them for the blessing and benefit of others. With no obligation, no demands, no laws requiring it, no genetics requiring it, nothing forcing him to do this. He, of his own free will, puts himself at risk to leverage his resources to bless and pour into and fill up the lives of those who don't have what he has. And bringing many sons to glory to make the captain of their salvation perfect through sufferings. This is voluntary giving of one's greater resources to those with lesser resources at the cost being borne by the person with the resources. Here's the next passage, Philippians chapter 2. Paul invites his hearers there in Philippians with these words. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem others how? Better than them. So where is the focus here with Paul? Where's the focus? It's switch the flow. Instead of thinking about how the church sees me, how my friends see me, how my neighbors see me, how my workmates see me, how my class sees me, how my wife sees me, how my boyfriend sees me, I'm thinking about how I become a blessing and a benefit and a giver into the lives of those around me. How does my workplace become transformed because I step into work that day? How does my class, because I sit down at my desk in school, how does that classroom become changed because I sit down? When I come to eat at your house, how does that home dynamic change because I've walked in? Like, what can I bring to the table that brings blessing into your life? What resources are behind me that I can pour out to enrich you? Rather than me coming in and saying, what can I get from you to enrich me? How many relationships collapse because one or both partners are in it? What can I get from me? How can I expand, build up, become better, look better, feel better? And so it's get, and eventually those relationships absolutely collapse because one is sucking the life out of the other. And when it's both ways, you have a nuclear reaction. Sometimes churches can do that. We come to church and we're like, what can I get? What can church do for me today? But the biblical paradigm of essential living is that I don't come to be a getter. I come to be an outflow, a giver. A God-defined reality is where my life is a switch the flow reality. Paul continues, verse 4, let each of you look out not only for his own interests, but also for the interests of others. So it's not that there's not a place for looking out for your interests and taking care of yourself, but it's that your priority is looking out for the interests of others, and you're living your life thinking about your impact in benefiting and blessing those in your circle of impact. What does that look like for you? Here's this fascinating text in Matthew chapter 5, and it is verse 43. Jesus is speaking here in the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. And notice the next text. That you may be sons of your Father in heaven. This is it. Jesus tells us that the essential nature of God and God-likeness is living life to bless, to infuse the world, the lives around you with God's love and goodness. That's the definition of how God is and who God is. That He lives to lift up, lives to bless, lives to give. And when it comes down to us living life in its essence, it's leveraging our resources and the benefits that come to us to better the lives of those around us. Jesus knew this would shake things up. He knew that when His disciples, when His listeners there on the mountain heard this, that they would start to wrestle because they would begin to see there's this competition. They would think about the bills. They would think about the neighbors. They would think about the other things going on in their lives, and they would be weighing, could they do this kingdom thing like the Father? Could they be like Daddy and live to give and love their enemies? But what happens if you love your enemies? And they could think of the losses they would suffer if they loved their enemies. So Jesus gave this counsel. You can't serve God and money. Jesus owned the reality. There is an internal competition, and let me just settle it. You can't do both. Therefore, I tell you, don't be anxious about your life. He said, you can't do both, so here's my way. Don't sit around worrying about yourself. And then you'll remember that passage, because then he talked about how lilies are taken care of, how birds are taken care of, how God generously and graciously sustains and provides for all living things. Because God wanted the people to realize that instead of living out of anxiety for how they were going to survive, they could live in the center of divine generosity and be a flow-through for that generosity into the lives of others. That would set them free from worrying about how to connect the pieces. It would set them free from worrying about how they looked in front of the neighbors. It would set them free from being worried about how they stacked up in the classroom. Because they were living in the sunshine of God's providence. And they could afford to give liberally and generously. And that's the section of text that he ends with this. Matthew 6:33, we touched on it last week. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you. Before Jesus said, seek first the kingdom, He said, listen, you can't do both. Now let me tell you, if you look at God's providence, He generously cares for His creation. And in that context, it's safe and wise, in fact, the wiser choice, to seek first the kingdom. Because God will take care of all the other pieces. I want to do a little illustration for you. I've got a little bit of water here. Now, this little guy is the person who is just taking in, right? They're taking in, and so we're just going to fill them up because they got a full life. They've got the Mercedes and the 6-bedroom house. They have the best job in town, and they've got a pile of friends, and they just soak it up. So we'll give them just about all they can take, and they're living a full life. But they're living a full life. I'm going to move this because y'all can't see. So they're living a full life, but a full life that is just about how much they can get. If their friends can't bring an entree to the meal, then the friend doesn't get invited the next time. If the friend can't bring a donation to the banquet, raising funds for whatever it is, then that friend is not invited again, because it's all about how full can I fill my cup. When the wife stops doing what this little man needs to feel good about himself, or this little woman needs to look good before her friends, then that person is just discarded because they've stopped filling the cup, right? So they live a full life, though, full to the brim. Now here's another person. And this person lives in a God-defined reality where they leverage their resources to bless others. And so their life fills up. And but as it's filling up, they begin to pour out into the lives of others. And so they pour, and that fills up one life. And then they pour into another life. God keeps pouring in. They pour into another life, and that life fills up. And so then they pour into another life. And it just keeps going. And I want you to watch what happens. Someone needs comfort. They've lost their mother, and so they pour themselves. God has given them a gift to comfort others, so they comfort someone who's struggling with deep grief. And then there's that lonely guy in prison. And so they're reaching out to comfort that lonely guy. There's the colicky baby. And a colicky baby keeps them up at night, but they pour love into that colicky baby. And then their boss is having a hard time, so they bring some chocolates to work, and they pour their life out. And then there is the church member they haven't seen in a while, and they drop in to offer a word of hope. And they're poured out again. But then God keeps pouring. Now, which life do you want to be? This guy is full, but he can't take any more. And here's the other thing. This guy's capacity to appreciate what he has, or this gal's capacity to appreciate what she has, diminishes the longer she spends living for herself. So they may have a full life, but the size of their full life actually shrinks, and their capacity to appreciate that full life actually shrinks. Whereas this person literally has a full life, but they have experienced, in this case, 8 full lives. So as we switch the flow, we literally expand our capacity to receive and experience the generous providence of God. Do you want a life that's full? That's more full than you have ever imagined? Then this is the way to live, the kingdom way. That is this outflow, flowing into the lives of others, and the capacity to experience the wonder of that overflow is increased, and the amount of overflow is increased because there's always room for more in the life that's poured into the lives of others. Jesus says in Matthew 25:34, in talking about what it looks like to be a child of God, then the king will say to those on his right hand, "Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in." Pardon me. "I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." Jesus' words on the final judgment picture, the sheep and the goats, are not separated because of their ambitions or what they stacked up in their lives. They're separated because of how their lives poured into the lives of others, or took from the lives of others. How will you live your life? What's it going to look like in this coming year? Are you going to be the end of this circuit of blessing, of this flow of blessing, looking for how everybody can fill your life and make you better? Or are you going to be the outflow? Remember the words of the Lord Jesus. He said, it is more what? Blessed to give than to receive. As you live into 2019, and specifically over these next 2 weeks, before our next segment in Essential Living, I want to invite you to do something very special. I want you to spend some time every day asking yourself a simple question. What does it look like in my life if I switch the flow? What would today look like if I spent it flowing into the lives of others rather than being a taker? And I want you to take a journal, whether it's an iPhone journal or a computer journal or a paper journal or a napkin journal, and record the reflection, the results of your reflection as you're hanging out with God, sorting through this idea of what it looks like if you switch the flow, if God flows through you instead of you again being just the end. And that will prepare you for our next installment, which is inflow. Because if we're not being flowed into, we can't flow out. But the first thing we got to process is, God, how can my life flow out so that I have space for inflow? So what's the phrase? Switch the flow. Reflect on that for the next 2 weeks and say, God, how does my life look if I switch the flow today? Our closing hymn is 373, and I believe that's Seeking the Lost. 373, Seeking the Lost.